Chapter 19 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In the month of June 1852, in pursuance of a previous contract, Mr. Avery, a carpenter of Bayou Rouge, commenced the erection of a house for Master Epps. It has previously been stated that there are no cellars on Bayou Boeuf. On the other hand, such is the low and swampy nature of the ground, the great houses are usually built upon spiles. Another peculiarity is, the rooms are not plastered, but the ceiling and sides are covered with matched cypress boards, painted such colour as most pleases the owner's taste. Generally the plank and boards are sawed by slaves with whip saws, there being no water power upon which mills might be built within many miles. When the planter erects for himself a dwelling, therefore, there is plenty of extra work for his slaves. Having had some experience under Tibeats as a carpenter, I was taken from the field altogether, on the arrival of Avery and his hands. Among them was one to whom I owe an immeasurable debt of gratitude. Only for him, in all probability, I should have ended my days in slavery. He was my deliverer, a man whose true heart overflowed with noble and generous emotions. To the last moment of my existence I shall remember him with feelings of thankfulness. His name was Bass, and at that time he resided in Marksville. It will be difficult to convey a correct impression of his appearance or character. He was a large man, between 40 and 50 years old, of light complexion and light hair. He was very cool and self-possessed, fond of argument, but always speaking with extreme deliberation. He was that kind of person whose peculiarity of manner was such that nothing he uttered ever gave offence. What would be intolerable coming from the lips of another could be said by him with impunity. There was not a man on Red River, perhaps, that agreed with him on the subject of politics or religion, and not a man, I venture to say, who discussed either of those subjects half as much. It seemed to be taken for granted that he would espouse the unpopular side of every local question, and it always created amusement rather than displeasure among his auditors, to listen to the ingenious and original manner in which he maintained the controversy. He was a bachelor, an old bachelor, according to the true acceptation of the term, having no kindred living, as he knew of, in the world. Neither had he any permanent abiding place, wandering from one state to another as his fancy dictated. He had lived in Marksville 3 or 4 years, and in the prosecution of his business as a carpenter, and in consequence likewise of his peculiarities, was quite extensively known throughout the parish of Avoyelles. He was liberal to a fault, and his many acts of kindness and transparent goodness of heart rendered him popular in the community, the sentiment of which he unceasingly combated. He was a native of Canada, from whence he had wandered in early life, and after visiting all the principal localities in the northern and western states, in the course of his peregrinations arrived in the unhealthy region of the Red River. His last removal was from Illinois. Whither he has gone now, I regret to be obliged to say is unknown to me. He gathered up his effects and departed quietly from Marksville the day before I did, the suspicions of his instrumentality in procuring my liberation rendering such a step necessary. For the commission of a just and righteous act he would undoubtedly have suffered death, had he remained within reach of the slave-whipping tribe on Bayou Boeuf. One day, while working on the new house, Bass and Epps became engaged in a controversy, to which, as will be readily supposed, I listened with absorbing interest. They were discussing the subject of slavery. "I tell you what it is, Epps," said Bass. "It's all wrong, sir. There's no justice nor righteousness in it. I wouldn't own a slave if I was as rich as Croesus, which I'm not, as is perfectly well understood, more particularly among my creditors. There's another humbug, the credit system. Humbug, sir. No credit, no debt. Credit leaves a man into temptation. Cash down is the only thing that will deliver him from evil. But this question of slavery, what right have you to your niggers when you come down to the point?" "What right?" said Epps, laughing. "Why, I bought 'em and paid for 'em." "Of course you did. The law says you have the right to hold a nigger, but, begging the law's pardon, it lies." "Yes, Epps, when the law says that, it's a liar, and the truth is not in it. Is everything right because the law allows it? Suppose they'd pass a law taking away your liberty and making you a slave." "Oh, that ain't a supposable case," said Epps, still laughing. "Hope you don't compare me to a nigger, Bass." "Well, Bass answered gravely. No, not exactly. But I have seen niggers before now as good as I am, and I have no acquaintance with any white man in these parts that I consider a whit better than myself. Now, in the sight of God, what is the difference, Epps, between a white man and a black one? All the difference in the world, replied Epps. You might as well ask what the difference is between a white man and a baboon. Now, I've seen one of them critters in Orleans that know just as much as any nigger I've got. You call them fellow citizens, I suppose? And Epps indulged in a loud laugh at his own wit. Look here, Epps, continued his companion, you can't laugh me down in that way. Some men are witty, and some ain't so witty as they think they are. Now, let me ask you a question. Are all men created free and equal as the Declaration of Independence holds they are? Yes, responded Epps, but all men, niggers, and monkeys ain't. And hereupon he broke forth into a more boisterous laugh than before. There are monkeys among white people as well as black, when you come to that, coolly remarked Bass. I know some white men that use arguments no sensible monkey would. But let that pass. These niggers are human beings. If they don't know as much as their masters, whose fault is it? They're not allowed to know anything. You have books and papers and can go where you please, and gather intelligence in 1,000 ways. But your slaves have no privileges. You'd whip one of them if you caught them reading a book. They're held in bondage, generation after generation, deprived of mental improvement, and who can expect them to possess much knowledge? If they're not brought down to a level with the brute creation, you slaveholders will never be blamed for it. If they are baboons, or stand no higher in the scale of intelligence than such animals, you and men like you will have to answer for it. There's a sin, a fearful sin resting on this nation, that will not go unpunished forever. There will be a reckoning yet. Yes, Epps, there's a day coming that will burn as an oven. It may be sooner or it may be later, but it's a-coming as sure as the Lord is just. If you lived up among the Yankees in New England, said Epps, I expect you'd be one of them cursed fanatics that know more than the Constitution and go about peddling clocks and coaxing niggers to run away. If I was in New England, returned Bass, I would be just what I am here. I would say that slavery was an iniquity and ought to be abolished. I would say there was no reason nor justice in the law or the Constitution that allows one man to hold another man in bondage. It would be hard for you to lose your property, to be sure, but it wouldn't be half as hard as it would be to lose your liberty. You have no more right to your freedom in exact justice than Uncle Abram yonder. Talk about black skin and black blood. Why, how many slaves are there on this bayou as white as either of us? And what difference is there in the colour of the soul? The whole system is as absurd as it is cruel. You may own niggers and be hanged, but I wouldn't own one for the best plantation in Louisiana. You like to hear yourself talk, Bass, better than any man I know of. You would argue that black was white or white black if anybody would contradict you. Nothing suits you in this world, and I don't believe you will be satisfied with the next if you should have your choice in them. Conversations substantially like the foregoing were not unusual between the two after this, Epps drawing him out more for the purpose of creating a laugh at his expense than with a view of fairly discussing the merits of the question. He looked upon Bass as a man ready to say anything merely for the pleasure of hearing his own voice, as somewhat self-conceited perhaps, contending against his faith and judgment in order simply to exhibit his dexterity in argumentation. He remained at Epps through the summer, visiting Marksville generally once a fortnight. The more I saw of him, the more I became convinced he was a man in whom I could confide. Nevertheless, my previous ill fortune had taught me to be extremely cautious. It was not my place to speak to a white man, except when spoken to, but I omitted no opportunity of throwing myself in his way, and endeavoured constantly in every possible manner to attract his attention. In the early part of August, he and myself were at work alone in the house, the other carpenters having left, and Epps being absent in the field. Now was the time, if ever, to broach the subject, and I resolved to do it, and submit to whatever consequences might ensue. We were busily at work in the afternoon, when I stopped suddenly and said, "Master Bass, I want to ask you what part of the country you came from." "Why, Platt, what put that into your head?" he answered. "You wouldn't know if I should tell you." After a moment or two he added, "I was born in Canada. Now, guess where that is." "Oh, I know where Canada is," said I. "I have been there myself." "Yes, I expect you are well acquainted all through that country," he remarked, laughing incredulously. "As sure as I live, Master Bass," I replied, "I have been there. I've been in Montreal, and Kingston, and Queenston, and I have been in New York State too, in Buffalo, and Rochester, and Albany, and can tell you the names of the villages on the Erie Canal and the Champlain Canal." Bass turned round and gazed at me a long time without uttering a syllable. "How came you here?" he inquired at length. "Master Bass," I answered, "if justice had been done, I never would have been here." "Well, how's this?" said he. "Who are you? You've been in Canada, sure enough. I know all the places you mention. How did you happen to get here? Come, tell me all about it." "I have no friends here," was my reply, "that I can put confidence in. I am afraid to tell you, though I don't believe you would tell Master Epps if I should." He assured me earnestly he would keep every word I might speak to him a profound secret, and his curiosity was evidently strongly excited. It was a long story, I informed him, and would take some time to relate it. Master Epps would be back soon, but if he would see me that night after all were asleep, I would repeat it to him. He consented readily to the arrangement, and directed me to come into the building where we were then at work, and I would find him there. About midnight, when all was still and quiet, I crept cautiously from my cabin, and silently entering the unfinished building, found him awaiting me. After further assurances on his part that I should not be betrayed, I began a relation of the history of my life and misfortunes. He was deeply interested, asking numerous questions in relation to localities and events. Having ended my story, I besought him to write to some of my friends at the North, acquainting them with my situation, and begging them to forward free papers, or take such steps as they might consider proper to secure my release. He promised to do so, but dwelt upon the danger of such an act in case of detection, and now impressed upon me the great necessity of strict silence and secrecy. Before we parted, our plan of cooperation was arranged. We agreed to meet the next night at a specified place among the high weeds on the banks of the bayou, some distance from Master's dwelling. There he was to write down on paper the names and address of several persons, old friends in the North, to whom he would direct letters during his next visit to Marksville. It was not deemed prudent to meet in the new house, inasmuch as the light it would be necessary to use might possibly be discovered. In the course of the day, I managed to obtain a few matches and a piece of candle, unperceived, from the kitchen, during a temporary absence of Aunt Phoebe. Bass had pencil and paper in his tool chest. At the appointed hour we met on the bayou bank, and creeping among the high weeds, I lighted the candle, while he drew forth pencil and paper and prepared for business. I gave him the names of William Perry, Cephas Parker, and Judge Marvin, all of Saratoga Springs, Saratoga County, New York. I had been employed by the latter in the United States Hotel, and had transacted business with the former to a considerable extent, and trusted that at least one of them would be still living at that place. He carefully wrote the names, and then remarked, thoughtfully, "It is so many years since you left Saratoga. All these men may be dead, or may have removed. You say you obtained papers at the Custom House in New York. Probably there is a record of them there, and I think it would be well to write and ascertain." I agreed with him, and again repeated the circumstances related heretofore, connected with my visit to the Custom House with Brown and Hamilton. We lingered on the bank of the bayou an hour or more, conversing upon the subject which now engrossed our thoughts. I could no longer doubt his fidelity, and freely spoke to him of the many sorrows I had borne in silence, and so long. I spoke of my wife and children, mentioning their names and ages, and dwelling upon the unspeakable happiness it would be to clasp them to my heart once more before I died. I caught him by the hand, and with tears and passionate entreaties implored him to befriend me, to restore me to my kindred and to liberty, promising I would weary Heaven the remainder of my life with prayers that it would bless and prosper him. In the enjoyment of freedom, surrounded by the associations of youth, and restored to the bosom of my family, that promise is not yet forgotten, nor shall it ever be so long as I have strength to raise my imploring eyes on high. O blessings on his kindly voice and on his silver hair, and blessings on his whole life long, until he meet me there. He overwhelmed me with assurances of friendship and faithfulness, saying he had never before taken so deep an interest in the fate of anyone. He spoke of himself in a somewhat mournful tone, as a lonely man, a wanderer about the world, that he was growing old, and must soon reach the end of his earthly journey, and lie down to his final rest without kith or kin to mourn for him, or to remember him, that his life was of little value to himself, and henceforth should be devoted to the accomplishment of my liberty, and to an unceasing warfare against the accursed shame of slavery. After this time we seldom spoke to or recognized each other. He was moreover less free in his conversation with Epps on the subject of slavery. The remotest suspicion that there was any unusual intimacy, any secret understanding between us, never once entered the mind of Epps, or any other person, white or black, on the plantation. I am often asked, with an air of incredulity, how I succeeded so many years in keeping from my daily and constant companions the knowledge of my true name and history. The terrible lesson Birch taught me impressed indelibly upon my mind the danger and uselessness of asserting I was a freeman. There was no possibility of any slave being able to assist me, while, on the other hand, there was a possibility of his exposing me. When it is recollected the whole current of my thoughts for 12 years turned to the contemplation of escape, it will not be wondered at that I was always cautious and on my guard. It would have been an act of folly to have proclaimed my right to freedom. It would only have subjected me to severer scrutiny, probably have consigned me to some more distant and inaccessible region than even Bayou Boeuf. Edwin Epps was a person utterly regardless of a black man's rights or wrongs, utterly destitute of any natural sense of justice, as I well knew. It was important, therefore, not only as regarded my hope of deliverance, but also as regarded the few personal privileges I was permitted to enjoy, to keep from him the history of my life. The Saturday night subsequent to our interview at the water's edge, Bass went home to Marksville. The next day, being Sunday, he employed himself in his own room writing letters. One he directed to the Collector of Customs at New York, another to Judge Marvin, and another to Messrs. Parker and Perry jointly. The latter was the one which led to my recovery. He subscribed my true name, but in the postscript intimated I was not the writer. The letter itself shows that he considered himself engaged in a dangerous undertaking, no less than running the risk of his life if detected. I did not see the letter before it was mailed, but have since obtained a copy, which is here inserted. Bayou Boeuf, August 15, 1852. Mr. William Perry or Mr. Cephas Parker. Gentlemen, it having been a long time since I have seen or heard from you, and not knowing that you are living, it is with uncertainty that I write to you, but the necessity of the case must be my excuse. Having been born free, just across the river from you, I am certain you must know me, and I am here now a slave. I wish you to obtain free papers for me, and forward them to me at Marksville, Louisiana, parish of Avoyelles, and oblige. Yours, Solomon Northup. The way I came to be a slave, I was taken sick in Washington City, and was insensible for a time. When I recovered my reason, I was robbed of my free papers, and in irons on my way to this state, and have never been able to get anyone to write for me until now, and he that is writing for me runs the risk of his life if detected. The allusion to myself in the work recently issued, entitled A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, contains the first part of this letter, omitting the postscript. Neither are the full names of the gentlemen to whom it is directed correctly stated, there being a slight discrepancy, probably a typographical error. To the postscript more than to the body of the communication am I indebted for my liberation, as will presently be seen. When Bass returned from Marksville, he informed me of what he had done. We continued our midnight consultations, never speaking to each other through the day, excepting as it was necessary about the work. As nearly as he was able to ascertain, it would require 2 weeks for the letter to reach Saratoga in due course of mail, and the same length of time for an answer to return. Within 6 weeks, at the farthest, we concluded, an answer would arrive, if it arrived at all. A great many suggestions were now made, and a great deal of conversation took place between us as to the most safe and proper course to pursue on receipt of the free papers. They would stand between him and harm, in case we were overtaken and arrested leaving the country altogether. It would be no infringement of law, however much it might provoke individual hostility, to assist a freeman to regain his freedom. At the end of 4 weeks he was again at Marksville, but no answer had arrived. I was sorely disappointed, but still reconciled myself with the reflection that sufficient length of time had not yet elapsed, that there might have been delays, and that I could not reasonably expect one so soon. 6, 7, 8, and 10 weeks passed by, however, and nothing came. I was in a fever of suspense whenever Bass visited Marksville, and could scarcely close my eyes until his return. Finally, my master's house was finished, and the time came when Bass must leave me. The night before his departure, I was wholly given up to despair. I had clung to him as a drowning man clings to the floating spar, knowing if it slips from his grasp, he must forever sink beneath the waves. The all-glorious hope, upon which I had laid such eager hold, was crumbling to ashes in my hands. I felt as if sinking down amidst the bitter waters of slavery, from the unfathomable depths of which I should never rise again. The generous heart of my friend and benefactor was touched with pity at the sight of my distress. He endeavored to cheer me up, promising to return the day before Christmas, and if no intelligence was received in the meantime, some further step would be undertaken to effect our design. He exhorted me to keep up my spirits, to rely upon his continued efforts in my behalf, assuring me in most earnest and impressive language that my liberation should, from thenceforth, be the chief object of his thoughts. In his absence the time passed slowly indeed. I looked forward to Christmas with intense anxiety and impatience. I had about given up the expectation of receiving any answer to the letters. They might have miscarried or might have been misdirected. Perhaps those at Saratoga, to whom they had been addressed, were all dead. Perhaps, engaged in their pursuits, they did not consider the fate of an obscure, unhappy black man of sufficient importance to be noticed. My whole reliance was in Bass. The faith I had in him was continually reassuring me, and enabling me to stand up against the tide of disappointment that had overwhelmed me. So wholly was I absorbed in reflecting upon my situation and prospects, that the hands with whom I labored in the field often observed it. Patsy would ask me if I was sick, and Uncle Abram and Bob and Wiley frequently expressed a curiosity to know what I could be thinking about so steadily. But I evaded their inquiries with some light remark, and kept my thoughts locked closely in my breast. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Faithful to his word, the day before Christmas, just at nightfall, Bass came riding into the yard. "How are you?" said Epps, shaking him by the hand. "Glad to see you." He would not have been very glad had he known the object of his errand. Quite well," answered Bass. "Had some business out on the bayou and concluded to call and see you, and stay overnight." Epps ordered one of the slaves to take charge of his horse, and with much talk and laughter they passed into the house together, not, however, until Bass had looked at me significantly, as much to say, "Keep dark, we understand each other." It was 10 o'clock at night before the labors of the day were performed, when I entered the cabin. At that time Uncle Abram and Bob occupied it with me. I laid down upon my board and feigned I was asleep. When my companions had fallen into a profound slumber, I moved stealthily out of the door, and watched and listened attentively for some sign or sound from Bass. There I stood until long after midnight, but nothing could be seen or heard. As I suspected, he dared not leave the house, through fear of exciting the suspicion of some of the family. I judged, correctly, he would rise earlier than was his custom, and take the opportunity of seeing me before Epps was up. Accordingly, I aroused Uncle Abram an hour sooner than usual, and sent him into the house to build a fire, which at that season of the year is a part of Uncle Abram's duties. I also gave Bob a violent shake, and asked him if he intended to sleep till noon, saying master would be up before the mules were fed. He knew right well the consequence that would follow such an event, and, jumping to his feet, was at the horse pasture in a twinkling. Presently, when both were gone, Bass slipped into the cabin. "No letter yet, Platt," said he. The announcement fell upon my heart like lead. "Oh, do write again, Master Bass," I cried. "I will give you the names of a great many I know. Surely they are not all dead. Surely someone will pity me." "No use," Bass replied. "No use. I have made up my mind to that. I fear the Marksville postmaster will mistrust something. I have inquired so often at his office. Too uncertain, too dangerous." "Then it is all over," I exclaimed. "Oh, my God, how can I end my days here?" "You're not going to end them here," he said, "unless you die very soon. I've thought this matter all over and have come to a determination. There are more ways than one to manage this business, and a better and surer way than writing letters. I have a job or two on hand which can be completed by March or April. By that time I shall have a considerable sum of money, and then, Platt, I am going to Saratoga myself." I could scarcely credit my own senses as the words fell from his lips, but he assured me, in a manner that left no doubt of the sincerity of his intention, that if his life was spared until spring, he should certainly undertake the journey. "I have lived in this region long enough," he continued. "I may as well be in one place as another. For a long time I have been thinking of going back once more to the place where I was born. I'm tired of slavery as well as you. If I can succeed in getting you away from here, it will be a good act that I shall like to think of all my life. And I shall succeed, Platt. I'm bound to do it. Now, let me tell you what I want. Epps will be up soon, and it won't do to be caught here. Think of a great many men at Saratoga and Sandy Hill, and in that neighborhood, who once knew you. I shall make excuse to come here again in the course of the winter, when I will write down their names. I will then know who to call on when I go north. Think of all you can. Cheer up, don't be discouraged. I'm with you, life or death. Goodbye, God bless you." And saying this, he left the cabin quickly and entered the great house. It was Christmas morning, the happiest day in the whole year for the slave. That morning he need not hurry to the field, with his gourd and cotton bag. Happiness sparkled in the eyes and overspread the countenances of all. The time of feasting and dancing had come. The cane and cotton fields were deserted. That day the clean dress was to be donned, the red ribbon displayed. There were to be reunions and joy and laughter and hurrying to and fro. It was to be a day of liberty among the children of slavery, wherefore they were happy and rejoiced. After breakfast, Epps and Bass sauntered about the yard, conversing upon the price of cotton and various other topics. "Where do your niggers hold Christmas?" Bass inquired. "Platt's going to Tanner's today. His fiddle's in great demand. They want him at Marshall's Monday, and Miss Mary McCoy on the old Norwood plantation writes me a note that she wants him to play for her niggers Tuesday." "He is rather a smart boy, ain't he?" said Bass. "Come here, Platt," he added, looking at me as I walked up to them, as if he had never thought before to take any special notice of me. "Yes," replied Epps, taking hold of my arm and feeling it. "There isn't a bad joint in him. There ain't a boy on the bayou worth more than he is. Perfectly sound and no bad tricks. Damn him, he isn't like other niggers. Doesn't look like 'em. Don't act like 'em. I was offered $1,700 for him last week." "And didn't take it?" Bass inquired with an air of surprise. "Take it? No. Devilish clear of it. Why, he's a reg'lar genius. Can make a plow beam, wagon tongue, anything as well as you can. Marshall wanted to put up one of his niggers agin him and raffle for them, but I told him I'd see the devil have him first." "I don't see anything remarkable about him," Bass observed. "Why, just feel of him now," Epps rejoined. "You don't see a boy very often put together any closer than he is. He's a thin-skinned cuss, and won't bear as much whipping as some, but he's got the muscle in him and no mistake." Bass felt of me, turned me round, and made a thorough examination, Epps all the while dwelling on my good points, but his visitor seemed to take but little interest finally in the subject, and consequently it was dropped. Bass soon departed, giving me another sly look of recognition and significance as he trotted out of the yard. When he was gone, I obtained a pass, and started for Tanner's, not Peter Tanner's, of whom mention has previously been made, but a relative of his. I played during the day and most of the night, spending the next day, Sunday, in my cabin. Monday I crossed the bayou to Douglas Marshall's, all Epps' slaves accompanying me, and on Tuesday went to the old Norwood place, which is the third plantation above Marshall's, on the same side of the water. The estate is now owned by Miss Mary McCoy, a lovely girl some 20 years of age. She is the beauty and the glory of Bayou Boeuf. She owns about 100 working hands, besides a great many house servants, yard boys, and young children. Her brother-in-law, who resides on the adjoining estate, is her general agent. She is beloved by all her slaves, and good reason indeed have they to be thankful that they have fallen into such gentle hands. Nowhere on the bayou are there such feasts, such merrymaking, as at young Madam McCoy's. Thither, more than to any other place, do the old and the young for miles around love to repair in the time of the Christmas holidays, for nowhere else can they find such delicious repasts, nowhere else can they hear a voice speaking to them so pleasantly. No one is so well beloved, no one fills so large a space in the hearts of 1,000 slaves as young Madam McCoy, the orphan mistress of the old Norwood estate. On my arrival at her place, I found 200 or 300 had assembled. The table was prepared in a long building, which she had erected expressly for her slaves to dance in. It was covered with every variety of food the country afforded, and was pronounced by general acclamation to be the rarest of dinners. Roast turkey, pig, chicken, duck, and all kinds of meat, baked, boiled, and broiled, formed a line the whole length of the extended table, while the vacant spaces were filled with tarts, jellies, and frosted cake, and pastry of many kinds. The young mistress walked around the table, smiling and saying a kind word to each one, and seemed to enjoy the scene exceedingly. When the dinner was over, the tables were removed to make room for the dancers. I tuned my violin and struck up a lively air. While some joined in a nimble reel, others patted and sang their simple but melodious songs, filling the great room with music mingled with the sound of human voices and the clatter of many feet. In the evening the mistress returned, and stood in the door a long time, looking at us. She was magnificently arrayed. Her dark hair and eyes contrasted strongly with her clear and delicate complexion. Her form was slender but commanding, and her movement was a combination of unaffected dignity and grace. As she stood there, clad in her rich apparel, her face animated with pleasure, I thought I had never looked upon a human being half so beautiful. I dwell with delight upon the description of this fair and gentle lady, not only because she inspired me with emotions of gratitude and admiration, but because I would have the reader understand that all slave owners on Bayou Boeuf are not like Epps, or Tibeats, or Jim Burns. Occasionally can be found, rarely it may be indeed, a good man like William Ford, or an angel of kindness like young Mistress McCoy. Tuesday concluded the 3 holidays Epps yearly allowed us. On my way home, Wednesday morning, while passing the plantation of William Pierce, that gentleman hailed me, saying he had received a line from Epps, brought down by William Varnell, permitting him to detain me for the purpose of playing for his slaves that night. It was the last time I was destined to witness a slave dance on the shores of Bayou Boeuf. The party at Pierce's continued their jollification until broad daylight, when I returned to my master's house, somewhat wearied with the loss of rest, but rejoicing in the possession of numerous bits and picayunes, which the whites, who were pleased with my musical performances, had contributed. On Saturday morning, for the first time in years, I overslept myself. I was frightened on coming out of the cabin to find the slaves were already in the field. They had preceded me some 15 minutes. Leaving my dinner and water gourd, I hurried after them as fast as I could move. It was not yet sunrise, but Epps was on the piazza as I left the hut, and cried out to me that it was a pretty time of day to be getting up. By extra exertion my row was up when he came out after breakfast. This, however, was no excuse for the offence of oversleeping. Bidding me strip and lie down, he gave me 10 or 15 lashes, at the conclusion of which he inquired if I thought, after that, I could get up sometime in the morning. I expressed myself quite positively that I could, and with back stinging with pain, went about my work. The following day, Sunday, my thoughts were upon Bass, and the probabilities and hopes which hung upon his action and determination. I considered the uncertainty of life, that if it should be the will of God that he should die, my prospect of deliverance, and all expectation of happiness in this world, would be wholly ended and destroyed. My sore back, perhaps, did not have a tendency to render me unusually cheerful. I felt downhearted and unhappy all day long, and when I laid down upon the hard board at night, my heart was oppressed with such a load of grief, it seemed that it must break. Monday morning, the 3rd of January, 1853, we were in the field betimes. It was a raw, cold morning, such as is unusual in that region. I was in advance, Uncle Abram next to me, behind him Bob, Patsy, and Wiley, with our cotton bags about our necks. Epps happened, a rare thing indeed, to come out that morning without his whip. He swore in a manner that would shame a pirate that we were doing nothing. Bob ventured to say that his fingers were so numb with cold he couldn't pick fast. Epps cursed himself for not having brought his rawhide, and declared that when he came out again he would warm us well. Yes, he would make us all hotter than that fiery realm in which I am sometimes compelled to believe he will himself eventually reside. With these fervent expressions he left us. When out of hearing, we commenced talking to each other, saying how hard it was to be compelled to keep up our tasks with numb fingers, how unreasonable master was, and speaking of him generally in no flattering terms. Our conversation was interrupted by a carriage passing rapidly towards the house. Looking up, we saw 2 men approaching us through the cotton field. Having now brought down this narrative to the last hour I was to spend on Bayou Boeuf, having gotten through my last cotton picking, and about to bid Master Epps farewell, I must beg the reader to go back with me to the month of August, to follow Bass's letter on its long journey to Saratoga, to learn the effect it produced, and that while I was repining and despairing in the slave hut of Edwin Epps, through the friendship of Bass and the goodness of Providence, all things were working together for my deliverance. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I am indebted to Mr. Henry B. Northup and others for many of the particulars contained in this chapter. The letter written by Bass, directed to Parker and Perry, and which was deposited in the post office in Marksville on the 15th day of August, 1852, arrived at Saratoga in the early part of September. Some time previous to this, Anne had removed to Glens Falls, Warren County, where she had charge of the kitchen in Carpenter's Hotel. She kept house, however, lodging with our children, and was only absent from them during such time as the discharge of her duties in the hotel required. Messrs. Parker and Perry, on receipt of the letter, forwarded it immediately to Anne. On reading it, the children were all excitement, and, without delay, hastened to the neighboring village of Sandy Hill to consult Henry B. Northup and obtain his advice and assistance in the matter. Upon examination, that gentleman found among the statutes of the state an act providing for the recovery of free citizens from slavery. It was passed May 14th, 1840, and is entitled, "An Act more effectually to protect the free citizens of this state from being kidnapped or reduced to slavery." It provides that it shall be the duty of the governor, upon the receipt of satisfactory information that any free citizen or inhabitant of this state is wrongfully held in another state or territory of the United States, upon the allegation or pretense that such person is a slave, or by color of any usage or rule of law is deemed or taken to be a slave, to take such measures to procure the restoration of such person to liberty as he shall deem necessary. And to that end he is authorized to appoint and employ an agent, and directed to furnish him with such credentials and instructions as will be likely to accomplish the object of his appointment. It requires the agent so appointed to proceed to collect the proper proof to establish the right of such person to his freedom, to perform such journeys, take such measures, institute such legal proceedings, etc., as may be necessary to return such person to this state, and charges all expenses incurred in carrying the act into effect upon moneys not otherwise appropriated in the Treasury. See Appendix A. It was necessary to establish 2 facts to the satisfaction of the governor. First, that I was a free citizen of New York, and secondly, that I was wrongfully held in bondage. As to the first point, there was no difficulty, all the older inhabitants in the vicinity being ready to testify to it. The second point rested entirely upon the letter to Parker and Perry, written in an unknown hand, and upon the letter penned on board the brig Orleans, which, unfortunately, had been mislaid or lost. A memorial was prepared, directed to His Excellency Governor Hunt, setting forth her marriage, my departure to Washington City, the receipt of the letters, that I was a free citizen, and such other facts as were deemed important, and was signed and verified by Anne. Accompanying this memorial were several affidavits of prominent citizens of Sandy Hill and Fort Edward, corroborating fully the statements it contained, and also a request of several well-known gentlemen to the governor that Henry B. Northup be appointed agent under the Legislative Act. On reading the memorial and affidavits, His Excellency took a lively interest in the matter, and on the 23rd day of November 1852, under the seal of the state, constituted, appointed, and employed Henry B. Northup, Esquire, an agent, with full power to effect my restoration, and to take such measures as would be most likely to accomplish it, and instructing him to proceed to Louisiana with all convenient dispatch. See Appendix B. The pressing nature of Mr. Northup's professional and political engagements delayed his departure until December. On the 14th day of that month he left Sandy Hill and proceeded to Washington. The Honorable Pierre Soule, Senator in Congress from Louisiana, Honorable Mr. Conrad, Secretary of War, and Judge Nelson of the Supreme Court of the United States, upon hearing a statement of the facts and examining his commission and certified copies of the memorial and affidavits, furnished him with open letters to gentlemen in Louisiana, strongly urging their assistance in accomplishing the object of his appointment. Senator Soule especially interested himself in the matter, insisting, in forcible language, that it was the duty and interest of every planter in his state to aid in restoring me to freedom, and trusted the sentiments of honor and justice in the bosom of every citizen of the Commonwealth would enlist him at once in my behalf. Having obtained these valuable letters, Mr. Northup returned to Baltimore, and proceeded from thence to Pittsburgh. It was his original intention, under advice of friends at Washington, to go directly to New Orleans, and consult the authorities of that city. Providentially, however, on arriving at the mouth of Red River, he changed his mind. Had he continued on, he would not have met with Bass, in which case the search for me would probably have been fruitless. Taking passage on the first steamer that arrived, he pursued his journey up Red River, a sluggish, winding stream flowing through a vast region of primitive forests and impenetrable swamps, almost wholly destitute of inhabitants. About 9 o'clock in the forenoon, January the 1st, 1853, he left the steamboat at Marksville, and proceeded directly to Marksville Courthouse, a small village 4 miles in the interior. From the fact that the letter to Messrs. Parker and Perry was postmarked at Marksville, it was supposed by him that I was in that place or its immediate vicinity. On reaching this town, he at once laid his business before the Honorable John P. Waddell, a legal gentleman of distinction, and a man of fine genius and most noble impulses. After reading the letters and documents presented him, and listening to a representation of the circumstances under which I had been carried away into captivity, Mr. Waddell at once proffered his services, and entered into the affair with great zeal and earnestness. He, in common with others of like elevated character, looked upon the kidnapper with abhorrence. The title of his fellow parishioners and clients to the property which constituted the larger proportion of their wealth not only depended upon the good faith in which slave sales were transacted, but he was a man in whose honorable heart emotions of indignation were aroused by such an instance of injustice. Marksville, although occupying a prominent position and standing out in impressive italics on the map of Louisiana, is, in fact, but a small and insignificant hamlet. Aside from the tavern, kept by a jolly and generous Boniface, the courthouse, inhabited by lawless cows and swine in the seasons of vacation, and a high gallows with its dissevered rope dangling in the air, there is little to attract the attention of the stranger. Solomon Northup was a name Mr. Waddell had never heard, but he was confident that if there was a slave bearing that appellation in Marksville or vicinity, his black boy Tom would know him. Tom was accordingly called, but in all his extensive circle of acquaintances there was no such personage. The letter to Parker and Perry was dated at Bayou Boeuf. At this place, therefore, the conclusion was, I must be sought. But here a difficulty suggested itself, of a very grave character indeed. Bayou Boeuf, at its nearest point, was 23 miles distant, and was the name applied to the section of country extending between 50 and 100 miles, on both sides of that stream. Thousands and thousands of slaves resided upon its shores, the remarkable richness and fertility of the soil having attracted thither a great number of planters. The information in the letter was so vague and indefinite as to render it difficult to conclude upon any specific course of proceeding. It was finally determined, however, as the only plan that presented any prospect of success, that Northup and the brother of Waddell, a student in the office of the latter, would repair to the bayou, and travelling up one side and down the other its whole length, inquire at each plantation for me. Mr. Waddell tendered the use of his carriage, and it was definitely arranged that they should start upon the excursion early Monday morning. It will be seen at once that this course, in all probability, would have resulted unsuccessfully. It would have been impossible for them to have gone into the fields and examine all the gangs at work. They were not aware that I was known only as Platt, and had they inquired of Epps himself, he would have stated truly that he knew nothing of Solomon Northup. The arrangement being adopted, however, there was nothing further to be done until Sunday had elapsed. The conversation between Messrs. Northup and Waddell, in the course of the afternoon, turned upon New York politics. I can scarcely comprehend the nice distinctions and shades of political parties in your state, observed Mr. Waddell. I read of soft shells and hard shells, hunkers and barn burners, woolly heads and silver greys, and am unable to understand the precise difference between them. Pray, what is it? Mr. Northup, refilling his pipe, entered into quite an elaborate narrative of the origin of the various sections of parties, and concluded by saying there was another party in New York, known as Free Soilers or Abolitionists. You have seen none of those in this part of the country, I presume, Mr. Northup remarked. Never, but one, answered Waddell laughingly. We have one here in Marksville, an eccentric creature, who preaches abolitionism as vehemently as any fanatic at the North. He is a generous, inoffensive man, but always maintaining the wrong side of an argument. It affords us a great deal of amusement. He is an excellent mechanic and almost indispensable in this community. He's a carpenter. His name is Bass. Some further good-natured conversation was had at the expense of Bass's peculiarities, when Waddell all at once fell into a reflective mood, and asked for the mysterious letter again. Let me see, he repeated thoughtfully to himself, running his eyes over the letter once more. Bayou Boeuf, August 15, postmarked here. He that is writing for me. Where did Bass work last summer? He inquired, turning suddenly to his brother. His brother was unable to inform him, but rising, left the office, and soon returned with the intelligence that Bass worked last summer somewhere on Bayou Boeuf. He is the man, bringing down his hand emphatically on the table, who can tell us all about Solomon Northup, exclaimed Waddell. Bass was immediately searched for, but could not be found. After some inquiry, it was ascertained he was at the landing on Red River. Procuring a conveyance, young Waddell and Northup were not long in traversing the few miles to the latter place. On their arrival, Bass was found, just on the point of leaving, to be absent a fortnight or more. After an introduction, Northup begged the privilege of speaking to him privately a moment. They walked together towards the river, when the following conversation ensued. Mr. Bass, said Northup, allow me to ask you if you were on Bayou Boeuf last August. Yes, sir, I was there in August, was the reply. Did you write a letter for a colored man at that place to some gentleman in Saratoga Springs? "Excuse me, sir, if I say that is none of your business," answered Bass, stopping and looking his interrogator searchingly in the face. "Perhaps I am rather hasty, Mr. Bass. I beg your pardon. But I have come from the state of New York to accomplish the purpose the writer of a letter dated the 15th of August, postmarked at Marksville, had in view. Circumstances have led me to think that you are perhaps the man who wrote it. I am in search of Solomon Northup. If you know him, I beg you to inform me frankly where he is, and I assure you the source of any information you may give me shall not be divulged, if you desire it not to be." A long time Bass looked his new acquaintance steadily in the eyes, without opening his lips. He seemed to be doubting in his own mind if there was not an attempt to practice some deception upon him. Finally, he said, deliberately, "I have done nothing to be ashamed of. I am the man who wrote the letter. If you have come to rescue Solomon Northup, I am glad to see you." "When did you last see him, and where is he?" Northup inquired. "I last saw him Christmas, a week ago to-day. He is the slave of Edwin Epps, a planter on Bayou Boeuf, near Holmesville. He is not known as Solomon Northup. He is called Platt." The secret was out. The mystery was unraveled. Through the thick black cloud, amid whose dark and dismal shadows I had walked 12 years, broke the star that was to light me back to liberty. All mistrust and hesitation were soon thrown aside, and the two men conversed long and freely upon the subject uppermost in their thoughts. Bass expressed the interest he had taken in my behalf, his intention of going North in the spring, and declaring that he had resolved to accomplish my emancipation if it were in his power. He described the commencement and progress of his acquaintance with me, and listened with eager curiosity to the account given him of my family, and the history of my early life. Before separating, he drew a map of the bayou on a strip of paper, with a piece of red chalk, showing the locality of Epps' plantation, and the road leading most directly to it. Northup and his young companion returned to Marksville, where it was determined to commence legal proceedings to test the question of my right to freedom. I was made plaintiff, Mr. Northup acting as my guardian, and Edwin Epps defendant. The process to be issued was in the nature of replevin, directed to the sheriff of the parish, commanding him to take me into custody, and detain me until the decision of the court. By the time the papers were duly drawn up, it was 12 o'clock at night, too late to obtain the necessary signature of the judge, who resided some distance out of town. Further business was therefore suspended until Monday morning. Everything, apparently, was moving along swimmingly, until Sunday afternoon, when Waddell called at Northup's room to express his apprehension of difficulties they had not expected to encounter. Bass had become alarmed, and had placed his affairs in the hands of a person at the landing, communicating to him his intention of leaving the state. This person had betrayed the confidence reposed in him to a certain extent, and a rumor began to float about the town that the stranger at the hotel, who had been observed in the company of lawyer Waddell, was after one of old Epps's slaves, over on the bayou. Epps was known at Marksville, having frequent occasion to visit that place during the session of the courts, and the fear entertained by Mr. Northup's adviser was that intelligence would be conveyed to him in the night, giving him an opportunity of secreting me before the arrival of the sheriff. This apprehension had the effect of expediting matters considerably. The sheriff, who lived in one direction from the village, was requested to hold himself in readiness immediately after midnight, while the judge was informed he would be called upon at the same time. It is but justice to say that the authorities at Marksville cheerfully rendered all the assistance in their power. As soon after midnight as bail could be perfected, and the judge's signature obtained, a carriage containing Mr. Northup and the sheriff, driven by the landlord's son, rolled rapidly out of the village of Marksville on the road towards Bayou Boeuf. It was supposed that Epps would contest the issue involving my right to liberty, and it therefore suggested itself to Mr. Northup that the testimony of the sheriff, describing my first meeting with the former, might perhaps become material on the trial. It was accordingly arranged during the ride that, before I had an opportunity of speaking to Mr. Northup, the sheriff should propound to me certain questions agreed upon, such as the number and names of my children, the name of my wife before marriage, of places I knew at the north, and so forth. If my answers corresponded with the statements given him, the evidence must necessarily be considered conclusive. At length, shortly after Epps had left the field, with the consoling assurance that he would soon return and warm us, as was stated in the conclusion of the preceding chapter, they came in sight of the plantation and discovered us at work. Alighting from the carriage, and directing the driver to proceed to the great house, with instructions not to mention to anyone the object of their errand until they met again, Northup and the sheriff turned from the highway and came towards us across the cotton field. We observed them, on looking up at the carriage, one several rods in advance of the other. It was a singular and unusual thing to see white men approaching us in that manner, and especially at that early hour in the morning, and Uncle Abram and Patsy made some remarks expressive of their astonishment. Walking up to Bob, the sheriff inquired, "Where's the boy they call Platt?" "Thar he is, massa," answered Bob, pointing to me and twitching off his hat. I wondered to myself what business he could possibly have with me, and turning round, gazed at him until he had approached within a step. During my long residence on the bayou, I had become familiar with the face of every planter within many miles, but this man was an utter stranger. Certainly I had never seen him before. "Your name is Platt, is it?" he asked. "Yes, master," I responded. Pointing towards Northup, standing a few rods distant, he demanded, "Do you know that man?" I looked in the direction indicated, and as my eyes rested on his countenance, a world of images thronged my brain, a multitude of well-known faces. Anne's, and the dear children's, and my old dead father's, all the scenes and associations of childhood and youth, all the friends of other and happier days, appeared and disappeared, flitting and floating like dissolving shadows before the vision of my imagination, until at last the perfect memory of the man recurred to me, and throwing up my hands towards heaven, I exclaimed, in a voice louder than I could utter in a less exciting moment, "Henry B. Northup! Thank God! Thank God!" In an instant I comprehended the nature of his business, and felt that the hour of my deliverance was at hand. I started towards him, but the sheriff stepped before me. "Stop a moment," said he. "Have you any other name than Platt?" "Solomon Northup is my name, master," I replied. "Have you a family?" he inquired. "I had a wife and 3 children. What were your children's names?" "Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo." "And your wife's name before her marriage?" "Ann Hampton." "Who married you?" "Timothy Eddy of Fort Edward." "Where does that gentleman live?" again pointing to Northup, who remained standing in the same place where I had first recognized him. "He lives in Sandy Hill, Washington County, New York," was the reply. He was proceeding to ask further questions, but I pushed past him, unable longer to restrain myself. I seized my old acquaintance by both hands. I could not speak. I could not refrain from tears. "Sol," he said at length, "I'm glad to see you." I essayed to make some answer, but emotion choked all utterance, and I was silent. The slaves, utterly confounded, stood gazing upon the scene, their opening mouths and rolling eyes indicating the utmost wonder and astonishment. For 10 years I had dwelt among them, in the field and in the cabin, borne the same hardships, partaken the same fare, mingled my griefs with theirs, participated in the same scanty joys. Nevertheless, not until this hour, the last I was to remain among them, had the remotest suspicion of my true name, or the slightest knowledge of my real history, been entertained by any one of them. Not a word was spoken for several minutes, during which time I clung fast to Northup, looking up into his face, fearful I should awake and find it all a dream. "Throw down that sack," Northup added finally. "Your cotton-picking days are over. Come with us to the man you live with." I obeyed him, and walking between him and the sheriff, we moved towards the great house. It was not until we had proceeded some distance that I had recovered my voice sufficiently to ask if my family were all living. He informed me he had seen Anne, Margaret, and Elizabeth but a short time previously, that Alonzo was also living, and all were well. My mother, however, I could never see again. As I began to recover in some measure from the sudden and great excitement which so overwhelmed me, I grew faint and weak, insomuch it was with difficulty I could walk. The sheriff took hold of my arm and assisted me, or I think I should have fallen. As we entered the yard, Epps stood by the gate, conversing with the driver. That young man, faithful to his instructions, was entirely unable to give him the least information in answer to his repeated inquiries of what was going on. By the time we reached him, he was almost as much amazed and puzzled as Bob or Uncle Abram. Shaking hands with the sheriff, and receiving an introduction to Mr. Northup, he invited them into the house, ordering me, at the same time, to bring in some wood. It was some time before I succeeded in cutting an armful, having somehow unaccountably lost the power of wielding the axe with any manner of precision. When I entered with it at last, the table was strewn with papers, from one of which Northup was reading. I was probably longer than necessity required in placing the sticks upon the fire, being particular as to the exact position of each individual one of them. I heard the words, "the said Solomon Northup," and "the deponent further says," and "free citizen of New York," repeated frequently, and from these expressions understood that the secret I had so long retained from Master and Mistress Epps was finally developing. I lingered as long as prudence permitted, and was about leaving the room, when Epps inquired, "Platt, do you know this gentleman?" "Yes, master," I replied. "I have known him as long as I can remember." "Where does he live?" "He lives in New York." "Did you ever live there?" "Yes, master, born and bred there." "You was free then? Now, you damned nigger," he exclaimed, "why did you not tell me that when I bought you?" "Master Epps," I answered in a somewhat different tone than the one in which I had been accustomed to address him. "Master Epps, you did not take the trouble to ask me. Besides, I told one of my owners, the man that kidnapped me, that I was free, and was whipped almost to death for it." "It seems there's been a letter written for you by somebody. Now, who is it?" he demanded authoritatively. I made no reply. "I say, who wrote that letter?" he demanded again. "Perhaps I wrote it myself," I said. "You haven't been to Marksville post office and back before light, I know." He insisted upon my informing him, and I insisted I would not. He made many vehement threats against the man, whoever he might be, and intimated the bloody and savage vengeance he would wreak upon him, when he found him out. His whole manner and language exhibited a feeling of anger towards the unknown person who had written for me, and of fretfulness at the idea of losing so much property. Addressing Mr. Northup, he swore if he had only had an hour's notice of his coming, he would have saved him the trouble of taking me back to New York, that he would have run me into the swamp, or some other place out of the way, where all the sheriffs on earth couldn't have found me. I walked out into the yard, and was entering the kitchen door, when something struck me in the back. Aunt Phoebe, emerging from the back door of the great house with a pan of potatoes, had thrown one of them with unnecessary violence, thereby giving me to understand that she wished to speak to me a moment confidentially. Running up to me, she whispered in my ear with great earnestness, "Lor' a'mighty, Platt, what do you think? Dem 2 men come after you. Heard 'em tell massa you free. Got wife and 3 children back there where you come from. Goin' wid 'em? Fool if you don't. Wish I could go." And Aunt Phoebe ran on in this manner at a rapid rate. Presently Mistress Epps made her appearance in the kitchen. She said many things to me, and wondered why I had not told her who I was. She expressed her regret, complimenting me by saying she had rather lose any other servant on the plantation. Had Patsy that day stood in my place, the measure of my mistress' joy would have overflowed. Now there was no one left who could mend a chair or a piece of furniture, no one who was of any use about the house, no one who could play for her on the violin, and Mistress Epps was actually affected to tears. Epps had called to Bob to bring up his saddle horse. The other slaves also, overcoming their fear of the penalty, had left their work and come to the yard. They were standing behind the cabins, out of sight of Epps. They beckoned me to come to them, and with all the eagerness of curiosity, excited to the highest pitch, conversed with and questioned me. If I could repeat the exact words they uttered, with the same emphasis, if I could paint their several attitudes and the expression of their countenances, it would be indeed an interesting picture. In their estimation, I had suddenly arisen to an immeasurable height, had become a being of immense importance. The legal papers having been served, and arrangements made with Epps to meet them the next day at Marksville, Northup and the sheriff entered the carriage to return to the latter place. As I was about mounting to the driver's seat, the sheriff said I ought to bid Mr. and Mrs. Epps good-bye. I ran back to the piazza where they were standing, and taking off my hat, said, "Good-bye, Mrs." "Good-bye, Platt," said Mrs. Epps kindly. "Good-bye, master." "Ugh, you damned nigger," muttered Epps in a surly, malicious tone of voice. "You needn't feel so cussed tickled. You ain't gone yet. I'll see about this business at Marksville tomorrow." I was only a "nigger," and knew my place, but felt as strongly as if I had been a white man that it would have been an inward comfort had I dared to have given him a parting kick. On my way back to the carriage, Patsy ran from behind a cabin and threw her arms about my neck. "Oh, Platt," she cried, tears streaming down her face, "you're going to be free. You're going way off yonder where we'll never see you any more. You saved me a good many whippings, Platt. I'm glad you're going to be free. But, oh, dear Lord, what'll become of me?" I disengaged myself from her and entered the carriage. The driver cracked his whip and away we rolled. I looked back and saw Patsy, with drooping head, half reclining on the ground. Mrs. Epps was on the piazza. Uncle Abram and Bob and Wiley and Aunt Phoebe stood by the gate, gazing after me. I waved my hand, but the carriage turned a bend of the bayou, hiding them from my eyes forever. We stopped a moment at Carey's sugar house, where a great number of slaves were at work, such an establishment being a curiosity to a northern man. Epps dashed by us on horseback at full speed, on the way, as we learned next day, to the Pine Woods, to see William Ford, who had brought me into the country. Tuesday, the 4th of January, Epps and his counsel, the Honorable H. Taylor, Northup, Waddell, the judge and sheriff of Avoyelles, and myself, met in a room in the village of Marksville. Mr. Northup stated the facts in regard to me, and presented his commission, and the affidavits accompanying it. The sheriff described the scene in the cotton field. I was also interrogated at great length. Finally, Mr. Taylor assured his client that he was satisfied, and that litigation would not only be expensive, but utterly useless. In accordance with his advice, a paper was drawn up and signed by the proper parties, wherein Epps acknowledged he was satisfied of my right to freedom, and formally surrendered me to the authorities of New York. It was also stipulated that it be entered of record in the Recorder's Office of Avoyelles. See Appendix C. Mr. Northup and myself immediately hastened to the landing, and taking passage on the first steamer that arrived, were soon floating down Red River, up which, with such desponding thoughts, I had been borne 12 years before. End of chapter 21. Louisiana, City, Chapter 22 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As the steamer glided on its way towards New Orleans, perhaps I was not happy. Perhaps there was no difficulty in restraining myself from dancing round the deck. Perhaps I did not feel grateful to the man who had come so many 100 miles for me. Perhaps I did not light his pipe, and wait and watch his word, and run at his slightest bidding. If I didn't, well, no matter. We tarried at New Orleans 2 days. During that time I pointed out the locality of Freeman's slave pen, and the room in which Ford purchased me. We happened to meet Theophilus in the street, but I did not think it worth while to renew acquaintance with him. From respectable citizens we ascertained he had become a low, miserable rowdy, a broken-down, disreputable man. We also visited the recorder, Mr. Genois, to whom Senator Soulet's letter was directed, and found him a man well deserving the wide and honorable reputation that he bears. He very generously furnished us with a sort of legal pass, over his signature and seal of office, and as it contains the recorder's description of my personal appearance, it may not be amiss to insert it here. The following is a copy. State of Louisiana, City of New Orleans, Recorder's Office, 2nd District. To all to whom these presents shall come. This is to certify that Henry B. Northup, Esquire, of the County of Washington, New York, has produced before me due evidence of the freedom of Solomon, a mulatto man, aged about 42 years, 5 feet 7 inches and 6 lines, woolly hair and chestnut eyes, who is a native born of the state of New York. That the said Northup, being about bringing the said Solomon to his native place through the southern routes, the civil authorities are requested to let the aforesaid colored man Solomon pass unmolested, he demeaning well and properly. Given under my hand and the seal of the City of New Orleans, this 7th January, 1853. T.H. Genois, Recorder. On the 8th, we came to Lake Pontchartrain by railroad, and in due time, following the usual route, reached Charleston. After going on board the steamboat, and paying our passage at this city, Mr. Northup was called upon by a custom house officer to explain why he had not registered his servant. He replied that he had no servant, that, as the agent of New York, he was accompanying a free citizen of that state from slavery to freedom, and did not desire nor intend to make any registry whatever. I conceived from his conversation and manner, though I may perhaps be entirely mistaken, that no great pains would be taken to avoid whatever difficulty the Charleston officials might deem proper to create. At length, however, we were permitted to proceed, and passing through Richmond, where I caught a glimpse of Goodin's pen, arrived in Washington January 17th, 1853. We ascertained that both Birch and Radburn were still residing in that city. Immediately a complaint was entered with a police magistrate of Washington against James H. Birch for kidnapping and selling me into slavery. He was arrested upon a warrant issued by Justice Goddard, and returned before Justice Mansell, and held to bail in the sum of $3,000. When first arrested, Birch was much excited, exhibiting the utmost fear and alarm, and before reaching the Justice's office on Louisiana Avenue, and before knowing the precise nature of the complaint, begged the police to permit him to consult Benjamin O. Shekels, a slave trader of 17 years' standing, and his former partner. The latter became his bail. At 10 o'clock, the 18th of January, both parties appeared before the magistrate. Senator Chase of Ohio, Honorable Orville Clark of Sandy Hill, and Mr. Northup acted as counsel for the prosecution, and Joseph H. Bradley for the defense. General Orville Clark was called and sworn as a witness, and testified that he had known me from childhood, and that I was a free man, as was my father before me. Mr. Northup then testified to the same, and proved the facts connected with his mission to Avoyelles. Ebenezer Radburn was then sworn for the prosecution, and testified he was 48 years old, that he was a resident of Washington, and had known Birch 14 years, that in 1841 he was keeper of William's slave pen, that he remembered the fact of my confinement in the pen that year. At this point it was admitted by the defendant's counsel that I had been placed in the pen by Birch in the spring of 1841, and hereupon the prosecution rested. Benjamin O. Shekels was then offered as a witness by the prisoner. Benjamin is a large, coarse-featured man, and the reader may perhaps get a somewhat correct conception of him by reading the exact language he used in answer to the first question of defendant's lawyer. He was asked the place of his nativity, and his reply, uttered in a sort of rowdyish way, was in these very words: "I was born in Ontario County, New York, and weighed 14 pounds." Benjamin was a prodigious baby. He further testified that he kept the Steamboat Hotel in Washington in 1841, and saw me there in the spring of that year. He was proceeding to state what he had heard two men say, when Senator Chase raised a legal objection, to wit, that the sayings of third persons, being hearsay, was improper evidence. The objection was overruled by the justice, and Shekels continued, stating that two men came to his hotel and represented they had a colored man for sale, that they had an interview with Birch, that they stated they came from Georgia, but he did not remember the county, that they gave a full history of the boy, saying he was a bricklayer and played on the violin, that Birch remarked he would purchase if they could agree, that they went out and brought the boy in, and that I was the same person. He further testified, with as much unconcern as if it was the truth, that I represented I was born and bred in Georgia, that one of the young men with me was my master, that I exhibited a great deal of regret at parting with him, and he believed, got into tears. Nevertheless, that I insisted my master had a right to sell me, that he ought to sell me, and the remarkable reason I gave was, according to Shekels, that he, my master, had been gambling and on a spree. He continued, in these words copied from the minutes taken on the examination: Birch interrogated the boy in the usual manner, told him if he purchased him he should send him south. The boy said he had no objection, that in fact he would like to go south. Birch paid $650 for him, to my knowledge. I don't know what name was given him, but think it was not Solomon. Did not know the name of either of the two men. They were in my tavern 2 or 3 hours, during which time the boy played on the violin. The bill of sale was signed in my bar-room. It was a printed blank filled up by Birch. Before 1838, Birch was my partner. Our business was buying and selling slaves. After that time, he was a partner of Theophilus Freeman of New Orleans. Birch bought here, Freeman sold there. Shekels, before testifying, had heard my relation of the circumstances connected with the visit to Washington with Brown and Hamilton, and therefore, it was, undoubtedly, he spoke of 2 men, and of my playing on the violin. Such was his fabrication, utterly untrue, and yet there was found in Washington a man who endeavored to corroborate him. Benjamin A. Thorne testified he was at Shekels in 1841, and saw a colored boy playing on a fiddle. Shekels said he was for sale, heard his master tell him he should sell him. The boy acknowledged to me he was a slave. I was not present when the money was paid, will not swear positively this is the boy. The master came near shedding tears. I think the boy did. I have been engaged in the business of taking slaves south, off and on, for 20 years. When I can't do that, I do something else. I was then offered as a witness, but objection being made, the court decided my evidence inadmissible. It was rejected solely on the grounds that I was a colored man, the fact of my being a free citizen of New York not being disputed. Shekels having testified there was a bill of sale executed, Birch was called upon by the prosecution to produce it, inasmuch as such a paper would corroborate the testimony of Thorne and Shekels. The prisoner's counsel saw the necessity of exhibiting it, or giving some reasonable explanation for its non-production. To effect the latter, Birch himself was offered as a witness in his own behalf. It was contended by counsel for the people that such testimony should not be allowed, that it was in contravention of every rule of evidence, and, if permitted, would defeat the ends of justice. His testimony, however, was received by the court. He made oath that such a bill of sale had been drawn up and signed, but he had lost it, and did not know what had become of it. Thereupon the magistrate was requested to dispatch a police officer to Birch's residence, with directions to bring his books, containing his bills of sales for the year 1841. The request was granted, and before any measure could be taken to prevent it, the officer had obtained possession of the books, and brought them into court. The sales for the year 1841 were found, and carefully examined, but no sale of myself, by any name, was discovered. Upon this testimony, the court held the fact to be established, that Birch came innocently and honestly by me, and accordingly he was discharged. An attempt was then made by Birch and his satellites to fasten upon me the charge that I had conspired with the 2 white men to defraud him. With what success appears in an extract taken from an article in the New York Times, published a day or 2 subsequent to the trial. The counsel for the defendant had drawn up, before the defendant was discharged, an affidavit, signed by Birch, and had a warrant out against the colored man for a conspiracy with the 2 white men before referred to defraud Birch out of $625. The warrant was served, and the colored man arrested and brought before Officer Goddard. Birch and his witnesses appeared in court, and H.B. Northup appeared as counsel for the colored man, stating he was ready to proceed as counsel on the part of the defendant and asking no delay whatever. Birch, after consulting privately a short time with Shekels, stated to the magistrate that he wished him to dismiss the complaint, as he would not proceed farther with it. Defendant's counsel stated to the magistrate that if the complaint was withdrawn, it must be without the request or consent of the defendant. Birch then asked the magistrate to let him have the complaint and the warrant, and he took them. The counsel for the defendant objected to his receiving them, and insisted they should remain as part of the records of the court, and that the court should endorse the proceedings which had been had under the process. Birch delivered them up, and the court rendered a judgment of discontinuance by the request of the prosecutor, and filed it in his office. There may be those who will affect to believe the statement of the slave trader, those in whose minds his allegations will weigh heavier than mine. I am a poor colored man, one of a downtrodden and degraded race, whose humble voice may not be heeded by the oppressor. But knowing the truth, and with a full sense of my accountability, I do solemnly declare before men and before God that any charge or assertion that I conspired directly or indirectly with any person or persons to sell myself, that any other account of my visit to Washington, my capture, and imprisonment in William's slave pen, than is contained in these pages, is utterly and absolutely false. I never played on the violin in Washington. I never was in the Steamboat Hotel, and never saw Thorne or Shekels, to my knowledge, in my life, until last January. The story of the trio of slave traders is a fabrication as absurd as it is base and unfounded. Were it true, I should not have turned aside on my way back to liberty for the purpose of prosecuting Birch. I should have avoided rather than sought him. I should have known that such a step would have resulted in rendering me infamous. Under the circumstances, longing as I did to behold my family, and elated with the prospect of returning home, it is an outrage upon probability to suppose I would have run the hazard, not only of exposure, but of a criminal prosecution and conviction, by voluntarily placing myself in the position I did, if the statements of Birch and his confederates contain a particle of truth. I took pains to seek him out, to confront him in a court of law, charging him with the crime of kidnapping, and the only motive that impelled me to this step was a burning sense of the wrong he had inflicted upon me, and a desire to bring him to justice. He was acquitted, in the manner and by such means as have been described. A human tribunal has permitted him to escape, but there is another and a higher tribunal, where false testimony will not prevail, and where I am willing, so far at least as these statements are concerned, to be judged at last. We left Washington on the 20th of January, and proceeding by way of Philadelphia, New York, and Albany, reached Sandy Hill in the night of the 21st. My heart overflowed with happiness as I looked around upon old familiar scenes, and found myself in the midst of friends of other days. The following morning I started, in company with several acquaintances, for Glen Falls, the residence of Anne and our children. As I entered their comfortable cottage, Margaret was the first that met me. She did not recognize me. When I left her, she was but 7 years old, a little prattling girl, playing with her toys. Now she was grown to womanhood, was married, with a bright-eyed boy standing by her side. Not forgetful of his enslaved, unfortunate grandfather, she had named the child Solomon Northup Staunton. When told who I was, she was overcome with emotion and unable to speak. Presently Elizabeth entered the room, and Anne came running from the hotel, having been informed of my arrival. They embraced me, and with tears flowing down their cheeks, hung upon my neck. But I draw a veil over a scene which can better be imagined than described. When the violence of our emotions had subsided to a sacred joy, when the household gathered round the fire that sent out its warm and crackling comfort through the room, we conversed of the 1,000 events that had occurred, the hopes and fears, the joys and sorrows, the trials and troubles we had each experienced during the long separation. Alonzo was absent in the western part of the state. The boy had written to his mother a short time previous, of the prospect of his obtaining sufficient money to purchase my freedom. From his earliest years, that had been the chief object of his thoughts and his ambition. They knew I was in bondage. The letter written on board the brig, and Clem Ray himself, had given them that information. But where I was, until the arrival of Bass's letter, was a matter of conjecture. Elizabeth and Margaret once returned from school, so Anne informed me, weeping bitterly. On inquiring the cause of the children's sorrow, it was found that, while studying geography, their attention had been attracted to the picture of slaves working in the cotton field, and an overseer following them with his whip. It reminded them of the sufferings their father might be, and, as it happened, actually was, enduring in the South. Numerous incidents, such as these, were related, incidents showing they still held me in constant remembrance, but not, perhaps, of sufficient interest to the reader to be recounted. My narrative is at an end. I have no comments to make upon the subject of slavery. Those who read this book may form their own opinions of the peculiar institution. What it may be in other states, I do not profess to know. What it is in the region of Red River is truly and faithfully delineated in these pages. This is no fiction, no exaggeration. If I have failed in anything, it has been in presenting to the reader too prominently the bright side of the picture. I doubt not hundreds have been as unfortunate as myself, that hundreds of free citizens have been kidnapped and sold into slavery, and are at this moment wearing out their lives on plantations in Texas and Louisiana. But I forbear. Chastened and subdued in spirit by the sufferings I have borne, and thankful to that good being through whose mercy I have been restored to happiness and liberty, I hope henceforward to lead an upright, though lowly life, and rest at last in the churchyard where my father sleeps. End of chapter 22. Appendix of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. Appendix A, page 291. Chapter 375. An act more effectually to protect the free citizens of this state from being kidnapped or reduced to slavery. Passed May 14, 1840. The people of the state of New York, represented in Senate and Assembly, do enact as follows. Point 1. Whenever the governor of this state shall receive information satisfactory to him that any free citizen or any inhabitant of this state has been kidnapped or transported away out of this state, or into any other state or territory of the United States, for the purpose of being there held in slavery, or that such free citizen or inhabitant is wrongly seized, is imprisoned or held in slavery in any of the states or territories of the United States, on the allegation or pretense that such a person is a slave, or by color of any usage or rule of law prevailing in such state or territory, is deemed or taken to be a slave, or not entitled of right to the personal liberty belonging to a citizen, it shall be the duty of the said governor to take such measures as he shall deem necessary to procure such person to be restored to his liberty and returned to this state. The governor is hereby authorized to appoint and employ such agent or agents as he shall deem necessary to effect the restoration and return of such person, and shall furnish the said agent with such credentials and instructions as will be likely to accomplish the object of his appointment. The governor may determine the compensation to be allowed to such agent for his services, besides his necessary expenses. Point 2. Such agent shall proceed to collect the proper proof to establish the right of such person to his freedom, and shall perform such journeys, take such measures, institute and procure to be prosecuted such legal proceedings, under the direction of the governor, as shall be necessary to procure such person to be restored to his liberty and returned to this state. Point 3. The accounts for all services and expenses incurred in carrying this act into effect shall be audited by the comptroller, and paid by the treasurer on his warrant, out of any moneys in the treasury of this state not otherwise appropriated. The Treasurer may advance, on the warrant of the Comptroller, to such agent such sum or sums as the Governor shall certify to be reasonable advances to enable him to accomplish the purposes of his appointment, for which advance such agent shall account on the final audit of his warrant. Point 4. This Act shall take effect immediately. Appendix B, page 292. Memorial of Anne. To His Excellency the Governor of the State of New York. The memorial of Anne Northup, of the village of Glens Falls, in the county of Warren, State aforesaid, respectfully sets forth that your memorialist, whose maiden name was Anne Hampton, was 44 years old on the 14th day of March last, and was married to Solomon Northup, then of Fort Edward, in the county of Washington and State aforesaid, on the 25th day of December, A.D. 1828, by Timothy Eddy, then a Justice of the Peace. That the said Solomon, after such marriage, lived and kept house with your memorialist in said town until 1830, when he removed with his said family to the town of Kingsbury in said county, and remained there about 3 years, and then removed to Saratoga Springs in the state aforesaid, and continued to reside in said Saratoga Springs and the adjoining town until about the year 1841, as near as the time can be recollected, when the said Solomon started to go to the city of Washington, in the District of Columbia, since which time your memorialist has never seen her said husband. And your memorialist further states that in the year 1841 she received information by a letter directed to Henry B. Northup, Esquire, of Sandy Hill, Washington County, New York, and postmarked at New Orleans, that said Solomon had been kidnapped in Washington, put on board of a vessel, and was then in such vessel in New Orleans, but could not tell how he came in that situation, nor what his destination was. That your memorialist ever since the last mentioned period has been wholly unable to obtain any information of where the said Solomon was, until the month of September last, when another letter was received from the said Solomon, postmarked at Marksville, in the parish of Avoyelles, in the state of Louisiana, stating that he was held there as a slave, which statement your memorialist believes to be true. That the said Solomon is about 45 years of age, and never resided out of the state of New York, in which state he was born, until the time he went to Washington City, as before stated. That the said Solomon Northup is a free citizen of the state of New York, and is now wrongfully held in slavery, in or near Marksville, in the parish of Avoyelles, in the state of Louisiana, one of the United States of America, on the allegation or pretense that the said Solomon is a slave. And your memorialist further states that Mintus Northup was the reputed father of said Solomon, and was a negro, and died at Fort Edward on the 22nd day of November, 1829. That the mother of said Solomon was a mulatto, or 3/4 white, and died in the county of Oswego, New York, some 5 or 6 years ago, as your memorialist was informed and believes, and never was a slave. That your memorialist and her family are poor and wholly unable to pay or sustain any portion of the expenses of restoring the said Solomon to his freedom. Your Excellency is entreated to employ such agent or agents as shall be deemed necessary to effect the restoration and return of said Solomon Northup, in pursuance of an act of the Legislature of the State of New York, passed May 14th, 1840, entitled, "An Act more effectually to protect the free citizens of this State from being kidnapped or reduced to slavery." And your memorialist will ever pray. Signed, Anne Northup. Dated November 19, 1852. State of New York, Washington County. Anne Northup of the village of Glen Falls, in the county of Warren, in said State, being duly sworn, doth depose and say that she signed the above memorial, and that the statements therein contained are true. Signed, Anne Northup. Subscribed and sworn before me this 19th November, 1852. Charles Hughes, Justice Peace. We recommend that the Governor appoint Henry B. Northup, of the village of Sandy Hill, Washington County, New York, as one of the agents to procure the restoration and return of Solomon Northup, named in the foregoing memorial of Anne Northup. Dated at Sandy Hill, Washington County, New York, November 20, 1852. Signed, Peter Holbrook, Daniel Sweet, B.F. Hogue, Alman Clark, Charles Hughes, Benjamin Ferris, E.D. Baker, Josiah H. Brown, Orville Clark. State of New York, Washington County. Josiah Hand of the village of Sandy Hill in said county, being duly sworn, says he is 57 years old, and was born in said village, and has always resided there. That he has known Mintus Northup and his son Solomon, named in the annexed memorial of Anne Northup, since previous to the year 1816. That Mintus Northup then, and until the time of his death, cultivated a farm in the towns of Kingsbury and Fort Edward, from the time deponent first knew him until he died. That said Mintus and his wife, the mother of said Solomon Northup, were reported to be free citizens of New York, and deponent believes they were so free. That said Solomon Northup was born in said county of Washington, as deponent believes, and was married December 25th, 1828 in Fort Edward aforesaid, and his said wife and 3 children, 2 daughters and 1 son, are now living in Glens Falls, Warren County, New York, and that the said Solomon Northup always resided in said county of Washington and its immediate vicinity until about 1841, since which time deponent has not seen him. But deponent has been credibly informed, and as he verily believes truly, the said Solomon is now wrongly held as a slave in the state of Louisiana. And deponent further says that Anne Northup, named in the said memorial, is entitled to credit, and deponent believes the statements contained in her said memorial are true. Signed, Josiah Hand. Subscribed and sworn before me this 19th day of November 1852. Charles Hughes, Justice Peace. State of New York, Washington County. Timothy Eddy of Fort Edward in said county, being duly sworn, says he is now over years old, and has been a resident of said town more than years last past, and that he was well acquainted with Solomon Northup, named in the annexed memorial of Anne Northup, and with his father, Mintus Northup, who was a negro. The wife of said Mintus was a mulatto woman. That said Mintus Northup and his said wife and family, 2 sons, Joseph and Solomon, resided in said town of Fort Edward for several years before the year 1828, and said Mintus died in said town A.D. 1829, as deponent believes. And deponent further says that he was a justice of the peace in said town in the year 1828, and as such justice of the peace, he, on the 25th day of December, 1828, joined the said Solomon in marriage with Anne Hampton, who is the same person who has subscribed the annexed memorial, and deponent expressly says that said Solomon was a free citizen of the state of New York, and always lived in said state until about the year A.D. 1840, since which time deponent has not seen him, but has recently been informed, and as deponent believes truly, that said Solomon Northup is wrongfully held in slavery in or near Marksville, in the parish of Avoyelles, in the state of Louisiana. And deponent further says that said Mintus Northup was nearly 60 years old at the time of his death, and was for more than 30 years next prior to his death a free citizen of the state of New York. And this deponent further says that Anne Northup, the wife of said Solomon Northup, is of good character and reputation, and her statements, as contained in the memorial hereto annexed, are entitled to full credit. Signed, Timothy Eddy. Subscribed and sworn before me this 19th day of November, 1852. Timothy Staunton, Justice. State of New York, Washington County. Henry B. Northup, of the village of Sandy Hill, in said county, being duly sworn, says that he is 47 years old, and has always lived in said county. That he knew Mintus Northup, named in the annexed memorial, from deponent's earliest recollection until the time of his death, which occurred at Fort Edward in said county in 1829. That deponent knew the children of said Mintus, viz. Solomon and Joseph. That they were both born in the county of Washington aforesaid, as deponent believes. That deponent was well acquainted with said Solomon, who is the same person named in the annexed memorial of Anne Northup, from his childhood. and that said Solomon always resided in said county of Washington and the adjoining counties until about the year 1841. That said Solomon could read and write. That said Solomon and his mother and father were free citizens of the state of New York. That sometime about the year 1841, this deponent received a letter from said Solomon, postmarked New Orleans, stating that while on business at Washington City, he had been kidnapped, and his free papers taken from him, and he was then on board a vessel, in irons, and was claimed as a slave, and that he did not know his destination, which the deponent believes to be true, and he urged this deponent to assist in procuring his restoration to freedom. That deponent has lost or mislaid said letter, and cannot find it. That deponent has since endeavored to find where said Solomon was, but could get no farther trace of him until September last, when this deponent ascertained by a letter purporting to have been written by the direction of said Solomon, that said Solomon was held and claimed as a slave in or near Marksville, in the parish of Avoyelles, Louisiana, and that this deponent verily believes that such information is true, and that said Solomon is now wrongfully held in slavery at Marksville aforesaid. Signed, Henry B. Northup. Subscribed and sworn to before me this 20th day of November, 1852. Charles Hughes, J.P. State of New York, Washington County. Nicholas C. Northup, of the village of Sandy Hill, in said county, being duly sworn, doth depose and say that he is now 58 years of age, and has known Solomon Northup, mentioned in the annexed memorial of Anne Northup, ever since he was born. And this deponent saith that said Solomon is now about 45 years old, and was born in the county of Washington, or in the county of Essex, in said state, and always resided in the state of New York until about the year 1841, since which time deponent has not seen him or known where he was, until a few weeks since deponent was informed, and believes truly, that said Solomon was held in slavery in the state of Louisiana. Deponent further says that said Solomon was married in the town of Fort Edward in said county, about 24 years ago, and that his wife and 2 daughters and 1 son now reside in the village of Glens Falls, county of Warren, in said state of New York. And this deponent swears positively that said Solomon Northup is a citizen of said state of New York, and was born free, and from his earliest infancy lived and resided in the counties of Washington, Essex, Warren, and Saratoga, in the state of New York, and that his said wife and children have never resided out of said counties, since the time said Solomon was married. That deponent knew the father of said Solomon Northup. That said father was a negro named Mintus Northup, and died in the town of Fort Edward, in the county of Washington, state of New York, on the 22nd day of November, A.D. 1829, and was buried in the graveyard in Sandy Hill aforesaid. That for more than 30 years before his death he lived in the counties of Essex, Washington, and Rensselaer, and state of New York, and left a wife and 2 sons, Joseph and the said Solomon, him surviving. That the mother of said Solomon was a mulatto woman, and is now dead, and died, as deponent believes, in Oswego County, New York, within 5 or 6 years past. And this deponent further states that the mother of the said Solomon Northup was not a slave at the time of the birth of said Solomon Northup, and has not been a slave at any time within the last 50 years. Signed, N.C. Northup. Subscribed and sworn before me this 19th day of November, 1852. Charles Hughes, Justice Peace. State of New York, Washington County. Orville Clark, of the village of Sandy Hill, in the county of Washington, state of New York, being duly sworn, doth depose and say, that he, this deponent, is over 50 years of age. That in the years 1810 and 1811, or most of the time of those years, this deponent resided at Sandy Hill, aforesaid, and at Glens Falls. That this deponent then knew Mintus Northup, a black or colored man. He was then a free man, as this deponent believes and always understood. That the wife of said Mintus Northup and mother of Solomon was a free woman. That from the year 1818 until the time of the death of said Mintus Northup, about the year 1829, this deponent was very well acquainted with the said Mintus Northup, that he was a respectable man in the community in which he resided, and was a free man, so taken and esteemed by all his acquaintances. That this deponent has also been and was acquainted with his son Solomon Northup, from the said year 1818 until he left this part of the country about the year 1840 or 1841. That he married Anne Hampton, daughter of William Hampton, a near neighbour of this deponent. That the said Anne, wife of said Solomon, is now living and resides in this vicinity. That the said Mintus Northup and William Hampton were both reputed and esteemed in this community as respectable men. And this deponent saith that the said Mintus Northup and his family, and the said William Hampton and his family, from the earliest recollection and acquaintance of this deponent with him, as far back as 1810, were always reputed, esteemed, and taken to be, and this deponent believes truly so, free citizens of the state of New York. This deponent knows the said William Hampton, under the laws of this state, was entitled to vote at our elections, and he believes the said Mintus Northup also was entitled as a free citizen with the property qualification. And this deponent further saith that the said Solomon Northup, son of said Mintus, and husband of said Anne Hampton, when he left this state, was at the time thereof a free citizen of the state of New York. And this deponent further saith that said Anne Hampton, wife of Solomon Northup, is a respectable woman, of good character, and I would believe her statements, and do believe the facts set forth in her memorial to His Excellency the Governor in relation to her said husband are true. Signed, Orville Clark. Sworn before me, November 19th, 1852. U.G. Paris, Justice of the Peace. State of New York, Washington County. Benjamin Ferris, of the village of Sandy Hill, in said county, being duly sworn, doth depose and say, that he is now 57 years old, and has resided in said village 45 years. That he was well acquainted with Mintus Northup, named in the annexed memorial of Anne Northup, from the year 1816 to the time of his death, which occurred at Fort Edward in the fall of 1829. That he knew the children of the said Mintus, namely Joseph Northup and Solomon Northup, and that the said Solomon is the same person named in said memorial. That said Mintus resided in the said county of Washington to the time of his death, and was during all that time a free citizen of the said state of New York, as deponent verily believes. That said memorialist, Anne Northup, is a woman of good character, and the statement contained in her memorial is entitled to credit. Signed, Benjamin Ferris. Sworn before me, November 19th, 1852, U.G. Paris, Justice of the Peace. State of New York, Executive Chamber, Albany, November 30, 1852. I hereby certify that the foregoing is a correct copy of certain proofs filed in the Executive Department, upon which I have appointed Henry B. Northup, an agent of this state, to take proper proceedings in behalf of Solomon Northup, therein mentioned. Signed, Washington Hunt, by the Governor, J.F.R., Private Secretary. State of New York, Executive Department. Washington Hunt, Governor of the State of New York, to whom it may concern, greeting. Whereas I have received information on oath, which is satisfactory to me, that Solomon Northup, who is a free citizen of this state, is wrongfully held in slavery in the state of Louisiana. And whereas it is made my duty by the laws of this state to take such measures as I shall deem necessary to procure any citizen so wrongfully held in slavery to be restored to his liberty and returned to this state. Be it known that in pursuance of Chapter 375 of the laws of this state, passed in 1840, I have constituted, appointed, and employed Henry B. Northup, Esquire, of the county of Washington, in this state, an agent with full power to effect the restoration of said Solomon Northup, and the said agent is hereby authorized and empowered to institute such proper and legal proceedings to procure such evidence, retain such counsel, and finally to take such measures as will be most likely to accomplish the object of his said appointment. He is also instructed to proceed to the state of Louisiana, with all convenient dispatch, to execute the agency hereby created. In witness thereof, I have hereunto subscribed my name, and affixed the privy seal of the state, at Albany, this 23rd day of November, in the year of our Lord 1852. Signed, Washington Hunt. James F. Ruggles, Private Secretary. Appendix C, page 309. State of Louisiana, Parish of Avoyelles. Before me, Aristide Barbin, Recorder of the Parish of Avoyelles, personally came and appeared Henry B. Northup, of the County of Washington, State of New York, who hath declared that by virtue of a commission to him as agent of the State of New York, given and granted by His Excellency Washington Hunt, Governor of the said State of New York, bearing date the 23rd day of November 1852, authorizing and empowering him, the said Northup, to pursue and recover from slavery a free man of color, called Solomon Northup, who is a free citizen of the State of New York, and who was kidnapped and sold into slavery in the State of Louisiana, and now in the possession of Edwin Epps, of the State of Louisiana, in the Parish of Avoyelles. He, the said agent, hereto signing, acknowledges that the said Edwin has this day given and surrendered to him, as such agent, the said Solomon Northup, free man of color, as aforesaid, in order that he be restored to his freedom, and carried back to the said State of New York, pursuant to said commission, the said Edwin Epps being satisfied from the proofs produced by said agent that the said Solomon Northup is entitled to his freedom. The parties consenting that a certified copy of said power of attorney be annexed to this act. Done and signed at Marksville, Parish of Avoyelles, this 4th day of January, 1853, in the presence of the undersigned, legal and competent witnesses who have also hereto signed. Signed, Henry B. Northup, Edwin Epps, Aid Barbin, Recorder. Witnesses, H. Taylor, John P. Waddell. State of Louisiana, Parish of Avoyelles. I do hereby certify the foregoing to be a true and correct copy of the original on file and of record in my office. Given under my hand and seal of office as Recorder, in and for the Parish of Avoyelles, this 4th day of January, A.D. 1853. Signed, Aid Barbin, Recorder. The End. End of 12 Years a Slave, by Solomon Northup.